Welcome to Carte Blanche, the show where candid conversations about our great city and state take center stage. I'm your host, Leila Logese-Cohen, and tonight I am thrilled to receive someone who has spent his career drafting policy around infrastructure. He understands the challenges of building mega projects, especially rail projects, better than most. He served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Transportation Secretary, and before that, he oversaw infrastructure policy for the Federal Railroad Administration. Tonight, we welcome Peter Cipriano to Carte Blanche. Today, Peter works for ASTM, the U.S. arm of an Italian company that specializes in public-private partnership infrastructure projects. If you think that transportation and infrastructure are too complicated, let me prove you wrong. Infrastructure is sexy. It plays a pivotal role in our lives, and its significance cannot be overstated. Here at Carte Blanche, we excel in navigating complex topics and transforming them into engaging and enjoyable discussions. Stay with us as we give Peter Cipriano carte blanche to talk about how we move people, why transportation matters so much, and why it is so difficult to build it. Peter, welcome.
Hi, Leila. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with this question. Why is it so hard to build infrastructure? Has it always been? Like, did the Romans have the same conversations?
I think it has always been. I mean, I wasn't there during Roman times. I haven't been drafting policy that long, but based on my readings, I think it has always been challenging. I think that post-World War II, it definitely got more complicated in the United States. We didn't have as many labor protections in construction. We certainly didn't have as much respect and care for private property, for community input, for the environment. You know, if you think about in the 1920s and 30s, the solution to fighting a lot of disease was to go to your local pond and just pour raw, untreated oil over the entire thing. People were actually encouraged to do that by their health department. So totally different.
We've gone a long way.
Yeah, totally different attitudes and laws passed to reflect those attitudes in the second half of the 20th century. And, you know, I think those things have had a net effect of, a net positive effect for society. But, you know, they've resulted in infrastructure delivery becoming a little more costly, a little more bureaucratic, just because there's more process baked in. And process requires expertise, and it requires patience.
But it also seems that there has been a disinvestment from maintaining infrastructure, and not only rail. I know that you and I are big rail.
Well, we're
nerds.
New Yorkers, so we think about rail a lot
all the time.
Yeah.
But even roads and bridges have suffered from disinvestment. Speak a little bit about that. In your professional experience in the past, what have been the challenges? So
I've just made the counter case for why infrastructure is a little more costly, and it's not all bad. The disinvestment, however, you're right, is kind of indefensible. If let's say Disney maintained its parks at the same degree that we maintained our roads and bridges, the shareholders would be in revolt. Now, why did that happen? A whole host of reasons. There was a huge kind of generational investment made post-war, 50s, 60s, of course, the Highway Act. Here, big impact for us was the dissolution of the private railroads, which kind of threw an entire mode of transportation into disarray, and they didn't start picking the pieces up until the 1980s. And
this is when Amtrak
was created. Everything's always inspected, everything is always made safe, but nothing beyond that. And then if you thinking beyond state of good repair. It's how do I improve the system? How do I get the train to run faster? How do I take a 3-hour New York DC trip, which is the most important city pair in the country? How do I take that from 3 hours and go to 1.5 hours so I'm competitive with Japan and with Europe? No money for that whatsoever. And in fact, as the decades accumulate, that backlog grows, and so the hole you find yourself in is deeper and deeper. At the same time, you have population growth, you have increased density. The East Coast looks completely different than it did in 1971. And
so we're choking on cars.
Yeah, yeah.
And the rail infrastructure is not up to the standard that's going to get people out of cars. Is it a fair representation of where we are today?
I think that modal shift, that's what they call it, that's what the economists call it, getting someone to move from one mode to another, is a super critical piece of climate resiliency and greening the economy. We've got to get people out of gasoline vehicles and into electric-powered trains. But that's right. In order to persuade the consumer to make that shift, you can't force them. You have to give them a marketable option. And on one of your previous with one of your previous guests, with Chris, you talked about how the car is very comfortable and such an attractive, seductive option.
Very
yeah,
sedusive.
I mean, we are all very familiar with Robert Moses. Probably most of your viewers are. So we all know that story. I think, again, post-war, there was a little too much assumption made about the miracle of the American automobile and how it would transform our lives and the way that we live, worked, and played. It did, in fact, transform.
It did.
We
created highways and
suburbs. It didn't all work out to be the utopia that they thought it would.
So you worked for the Department of Transportation, for the U.S. Department of Transportation. You have a good sense of mega projects and what it takes to get them moving forward. Speak a little bit about that. Is it even the word? It's like mega projects. Like,
yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And they seem to be critical and necessary.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's like, why didn't you do smaller projects all along?
Yeah.
But here we are. Now we are doing mega projects. So are they this beast that is almost destined to fail, or do mega projects get to see the day of light?
So, yes, again, after this very long period of disinvestment, we find ourselves with a huge capital backlog nationally across all asset types that has to be addressed. No, I don't think they're doomed at all. I think, in fact, I guess I'm going to give the glass half full again. Most mega projects succeed insofar as they get built. East Side Access is done, and you can now ride the train into Grand Central from Long Island, and it's a huge success. And kudos to the MTA for getting it done. We should all study why it took 3 times as long as it was supposed to and cost 4 times as much as it ought to have. We have to study that. The same way you have to study why the Big Dig in Boston, what similar parameters, right? Something like 3 or 4 times longer than it should have and 3 or 4 times more than it should have cost.
Do you remember, did you ever travel to Boston when that project was ongoing? Do you remember this huge billboard that the city had put in front of it?
No.
Oh my God, it is priceless. And it says, huge, massive billboard. And it said, if Rome had been built in a day, we would have hired their engineers.
Yeah, I mean.
So they took full ownership.
Yes.
Like, you know what?
Yeah.
Screw it.
Yeah, exactly.
It takes a long time, and I know you're cranky, but
right. And the end result there is definitely very good.
Is it the nature of the beast in the end that it is going to cost, that much more?
No. Mistakes do get made, and there are ways to better run a project and try to avoid those mistakes and try to mitigate risk. I mean, fundamentally, I'd say mega projects are all about risk. That's the word. It's the most important word. It's about assessing the risk on the table and then coming up with realistic strategies to mitigate those risks.
But before we even get there, isn't there a big politics part of getting those projects off the ground? Because
Politics is a risk.
Okay.
I mean, when I look at a project, political risk is always one of my top line categories. How many governors will it take to build whatever it is? Can this get done can it credibly get done in the term of whomever is governor at the moment? Or realistically, will this take 2 or even, God forbid, 3 governors? Your risk profile goes through the roof because you have no idea who the governor will be in 5 years or 6 years if there's an election, and you have no idea how that governor will react to your project at that point in time, or what the macroeconomic circumstances will be at that time. Think ARC with Governor Christie, right? So political risk is a big one when you're building public infrastructure. But in our space with transportation, we're thinking about political risk all the time. I think if you look at GDC, the Gateway Commission, and Chris Calori, their leader, like he's doing a great job thinking about all that stuff. So there's an example of a beast of a project. But in its planning phase, they have owned a number of upward cost revisions. See, not cost increases, upward cost revisions.
The euphemism.
They've owned those. They've explained why they're happening. We have inflation. You have design changes. You learn things about the riverbed and the rock type, and things end up costing more than you hoped. But I think they're doing a great job owning it. And my bet is that that project it'll take a long time to build, but it will come in reasonably on schedule. It'll be a long schedule, but it'll come in on that schedule.
But they're already 10 years delayed. If you, and we can say that with a degree of of accuracy because the MTA in charge of all the other tunnels in the city, that have trains going through them, have all been fixed after Sandy. And this project started, I mean, it was not initiated really by Sandy, but it really became a priority
by it,
because of Sandy. And work has not even started.
You're 100% right. That's pure politics. That's not even political risk. That was just 10 years of politics, good old-fashioned politics. So we have the highest rate of utilization of every infrastructure asset type in the United States. So busiest airport, busiest train station, first, second, and third busiest railroad, busiest transit system, busiest bus system, busiest tunnel, busiest bridge, busiest road, on and on and on, right? So, and usually when you look at any one of those individual assets, our first place ranking is, orders of magnitude higher than the second and third place, whether it's in Chicago or LA or whatever. Really shocking numbers. Oh, port, container terminal, it's everything. So there's a tremendous amount of cost and risk and challenge associated with anything in our region. That's the first thing. The second is, to your point, our region just so happens to be a beautiful water region, right? We're a city of islands and rivers, and that has inured massively to our benefit over time, and has to continue to be a part of the city's growth into this century. But that presents challenges, and the British decided to draw a dotted line down the Hudson River. So The Dutch didn't.
Those damn Brits.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Dutch had a better understanding of the region, I think, with New Amsterdam. It was all one political jurisdiction on both sides of the river. But the Brits changed it up, and we thank them for it. And we have that system till this day. And the way that our republic is established, it's very challenging for two states, two governors, four legislative bodies, right, to kind of work together on these huge critical crossings. You know, I would say in the world, because what we have organically here in the New York region is tremendous talent, and the building trades also. The men and women who actually build the stuff, tremendous talent in New York, like you don't have anywhere else in the U.S., except maybe in Texas and Oklahoma with people who drill for oil. They're very, very talented, but that's a specific application. And then we also have the benefit of that internationalism. All of the best engineering talent from Asia and Europe comes here too.
Yeah, yeah. So with all this great talent, this is the hopeful moment where we say, hooray, we're going to have a new Penn Station.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's
What's your take
as far
on that?
as I'm concerned, all the pieces have been aligned. Look, I think we are in a moment in time where there's a tremendous the need is clear, right? The consensus around the need is clear. And the dump of Penn Station isn't very compelling marketing. So, you know, it's got to be done. We all know it has to be done.
So speak a little bit about ASTM and your projects.
Yeah, I mean, we've, you know, put together what I think we feel is the most deliverable, practical plan for Penn Station in a long, long time. It doesn't displace anyone from their home. It doesn't displace the garden. It doesn't displace the existing office. Doesn't displace the railroads, and in fact, it expands and greatly improves the railroad facility, both front of house and back of house. It's fully financeable, and in fact, financed, meaning that the way that we pay for it is totally realistic, and the money is in effect there to do it.
So it would be a P3 model.
Yeah, you could use that.
Partnership.
I mean, P3, public-private partnership. It means something different to everyone. And at the same time means absolutely nothing.
P3s come in a variety of flavors.
Right, in a variety of flavors. In this context, P3 means that essentially a developer has put the deal together. That includes acquiring property from Madison Square Garden, the Hulu Theater, formerly the Hulu Theater on 8th Avenue. And maybe more importantly than acquiring that property is working out with MSG and with Vornado a realistic plan for how to perform this construction, because this is obviously very disruptive and invasive construction. And
so what is your relationship with MSG?
It's a great one. I mean, in our view, and in my view, they've been a tremendous partner. They're really serious people, no surprise. They have two hopefully champion sports franchises. And, you know, they also operate the world's busiest and most value-producing arena, which also inures greatly to the benefit of our city. So, I mean, they're serious people, and they understand that Penn Station is an important part of their growth. And of course they want it improved, but they need it to be improved in a partnership mentality. And I just think we've been able to structure that. Once we approached the conversation with that spirit, they were fantastic.
So I read somewhere that you actually cold called them initially.
That's true. Yes. That conversation has to start someplace, right? Yes, cold called them. They certainly weren't sitting out with a booth saying, does anyone want to buy the theater? You know, never.
What did they say? What was their reaction?
Professional and professional, open, surprised, but serious from the start. It was really from day one. It just sort of clicked. Yeah, they could have. Other entities, I'm sure, would have hung up the phone. No, thank you. But that was not their attitude. They did their diligence and who are you, who's ASTM, all of that, and we were able to get going. And we did, Layla, to date, I'd say 3 years of design and engineering and construction phasing work together. Just tremendous amount of effort.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated site,
yes.
And if it was not complicated, it would be done already.
Yes, exactly.
And there are so many cooks in the kitchen because
yes.
the station is owned by Amtrak.
Yeah.
What is above grade is owned by MSG and Vornado.
Right.
With, between themselves, they have a sort of like complicated ownership with tons of easements that, I think there's only one person who knows exactly where everything is. It, sits in her brain, and, we're just hoping that, she's there in perpetuity because it's just so complicated. And to make anything happen
yeah.
requires just so much coordination.
Yeah.
So
yep.
Speak a little bit about, having to deal with, so many stakeholders.
I think it's Penn Station. You've described it perfectly. The problems there, the cross-jurisdictional problems, the Venn diagram that I think about, is a microcosm of what we have in the whole region, as you said before, right? That dotted line down the river, and how do you get New York and New Jersey to figure stuff out, even when it's not in one's exclusive interest? We have all of that going on. In very close, dirty, dark conditions in Penn Station, and it makes everyone grumpy and cranky, and people are trying to move trains in and out, and you have frontline workers in safety-critical roles who, they're laser focused. If you've ever spent time with railroad operations people, right? Mm. We had to remember that the railroads are, first and foremost, railroads. And I have found that the institutional culture kind of comes from the bottom up. So a lot of the management people that you and I may deal with at MTA or NJT or Amtrak, the culture that they're existing in really comes from those frontline safety critical workers. And their mentality is, get out of my way, I have a train to move. And if that train doesn't have my logo on it, you're not my priority. So it's very challenging. And how do you navigate it? You got to negotiate it, and you have to find the common ground between each. I think again, thinking about the Venn diagram, what are the common objectives? And if you find a few common objectives or programmatic goals, can I merge them and expand upon them? Because the bigger, the 3 circles of the Venn diagram with that central piece, the goal is to get that central piece to be as wide as possible and to have the external circles shrink. And that's what I've tried to do.
So speak a little bit about the reception given to your project. How did MTA react?
Well, why don't you tell me? My memory is failing me. I've gone for hypnotherapy, actually. I've forced myself to forget.
There's been abundant press reporting on it, so
yeah.
I think it's been memorialized.
Yeah, it's been memorialized. The chairman was very vocal himself about it. So
yeah. So speak a little bit about that. Is it something that is typical in these kinds of situations? Where does it stem from, and what is the path forward?
I think that certainly in the history of Penn Station, agita is typical and is guaranteed. So you just don't necessarily know from which quarter it will come from. I might have sooner thought that the community, for example, would be the wellspring of dispute. Or maybe one of the private property owners. I did not expect it to be one of the public agencies, especially when 2 of the 3 are on board with the plan, in effect, or, you know, largely supportive of. That was a surprise. Don't know why, but
you have your ideas.
Yeah, of course. I mean, again, I think the chairman spoke to it last April in his board meeting. He spoke at length about his feelings. As I recall, it was sort of, I guess, if you want to call it an intellectual opposition to the idea of an 8th Avenue entrance, that it's redundant with Moynihan. You know, that's functionally not the case, but that's sort of what he described. So you can go back and watch. But I think in the end, it's, you know, the MTA means well. Obviously, they've got a very tough job at Penn Station. Historically, they run the most customers, but they're only a leaseholder. And I think that's a frustrating circumstance to be in.
So is it a governance issue with Penn Station?
Yeah, it's a governance issue. You know, the Amtrak owns the station, as you said, and consequent to that, the station is a federal property, so there's all kinds of federal rules and ways of doing things, and Amtrak ways of doing things that, you know, aren't the way that the transit agencies necessarily do things. The way Amtrak wants or requires things to be done is not the way that the MTA does things at Grand Central. Since East Side Access opened, Long Islanders are now selecting Grand Central as their destination for Midtown East offices, which is exactly what we knew would happen.
Yeah.
That's why we built.
Well, that was the purpose.
That was the purpose. So there hasn't been great data post-COVID, but NJT is captive to Penn. They have no place else to go.
Until through running becomes a thing.
Until through running becomes a thing, of course. So yeah. 8th Avenue subway, so the ACE, now exceeds 123 7th Avenue ridership. And pre-COVID, that was absolutely not the case, but it is the case now.
Interesting.
Everything has just shifted fundamentally, and all of that, kind of the whole story like quilts together. All of the growth that we've had on the far west side, which of course we have to remember is publicly subsidized, publicly induced growth. So when we think about the importance of an 8th Avenue entrance, and when we think about dismissing it, you're actually dismissing
public investment,
years and billions of dollars of public investment, which is not, with all due respect, correct on its face.
Yeah, no, that's actually very interesting to look at it this way.
So there's sort of two ways that I look at it. All of the data, demographic data, economic data, anything you want to point to would seem to suggest that an 8th Avenue entrance is very reasonable.
Yeah.
In our scheme, we also create enough retail within the station to actually pay for the 8th Avenue, for the property acquisition. The check that has to be written to MSG, that is completely covered by the new retail that's created as a result of that demolition. So that's another thing to think about. The final thing, though, that to me is super important, just looking at the structural problem of Penn, right? Let's think like a construction worker or an engineer for a moment. If the parameters of the problem are, I need to improve Penn, I need to maximize air, light, and space in the station, just make it a better place, as better as possible, while maintaining the garden, right? There's a whole different conversation if you say, well, what if I take the garden away? But your parameter is you have to keep the garden. Well, once you start to attack that puzzle and say, can I do this, can I do that, as a matter of mathematics, it becomes abundantly clear that the theater removal is the best, most productive use of capital and yields you the greatest square footage and actual sunlight exposure in the station. Nothing else comes even close. The taxiway is only 50 feet wide.
Yeah,
the dimensions are clear as day, no pun intended. You're talking about a 50-foot wide driveway, which especially if the GPP were to get fully built out, you have to realize that the taxiway will be completely enveloped in super tall office buildings, and it will actually have no daylight exposure whatsoever. The 8th Avenue facade is always safe from that. So, we've incorporated a mid-block train hall, a glass atrium in our scheme, which I think, is very additive, and it also allows us to do a totally improved truck loading. And I do credit the MTA for, coming up with that kind of interesting idea of having a mid-block daylighting experience. It is a good opportunity to exploit, but it can't be the major move because it just doesn't work out.
So what is next with your project?
I don't know. For us, we're here. We're not going anywhere. The plan is essentially drawn and drafted. The financial structure, it worked yesterday, it works today, it'll work tomorrow. Obviously, costs only revise upward over time due to inflation. But beyond inflation, whatever CPI you might apply to the $6 billion that I talked about last year, there won't be any surprises with our scheme. And of course, that CPI applies to any Penn Station.
What is in the way to just get this whole thing going?
Well, it's an election year now, so I think we probably all have to be a little patient and see how that pans out. We went public last year for a reason. I think, especially with my background, I think last year was the time to do it. And we for our part, worked very hard in 2021 and 22 to get to a place where we would have a shovel-ready plan well in advance of the presidential election. Again, risk assessment, risk mitigation. Unfortunately, we just, weren't able to get there, which is tough. Feeling like you lost is really, really tough. And I'll be honest, it wasn't always an easy 6 months, the last 6 months, but the law of gravity will prevail. The plan makes sense.
So just to orient people, the plan is going to be contingent on federal funding, right?
Yes. So federal financing.
Yeah.
So there are these ultra low interest loans that exist at USDOT.
Yeah. So the RIF and TIF.
Yes, and their purpose is infrastructure projects. Doesn't have to be a P3. In fact, the MTA took out $1 billion RIF loan when I was there to support its implementation of positive train control. So sometimes even public agencies use it. But it's the cheapest money there is. It's cheaper than any kind of bond issue.
And it's a 75-year
loan. It's also, it's the durations are nuts, and you don't have to start paying it back until the thing is totally built.
So is there money in the bank for Penn Station?
There's all the money you could ever need in the loan programs. They're kind of designed to never run out of money. So there's money there.
What about the grants?
The grants are subject to the election, I would say, because the IIJA, President Biden's infrastructure law, created this historic level of funding for Amtrak, principally, and for intercity rail. But we're now in the last 15 months or something of the IIJA, so it expires soon. Only really have one fiscal year of money left to give out.
So does it mean that we missed the opportunity?
In my view, yes. I mean, there's I think I'm being very conservative saying in my view. It's not just my view. I think it's a stated fact. So the way that they structured this grant, one of the big grants, is they issued a list of projects. They said, okay, here are all the projects that exist in the Northeast, from Boston to Washington, priorities of different states and governors, all this good stuff. Here's how much money we have to give out over 5 years. And then they ranked the projects, they sort of prioritized them.
So
and
Delaware got a lot of money,
yeah,
Maryland,
Delaware, Massachusetts, yeah, New Jersey.
And New York got some. It's not like New York
we got
was
tons.
totally
Penn Station access
ignored,
got a lot of money,
which is great.
Yeah, yeah.
And once again, to
Hudson Tunnel, lot of money.
To situate the audience, Penn Access is actually a brand new rail line that is going to take people through Yonkers and bring them directly into Penn Station.
Actually, so it's Connecticut and East Bronx.
It is going to be transformative for sure. But so there's going to be more people coming into Penn, but it looks like I say this sort of like very generic we, because I'm not even sure who we is, but stakeholders.
It's a royal we.
Certainly not a royal we, but on the contrary, a sort of like super democratic we of all the users who need Penn Station for all the reasons that we need this super important train hub. We're all banking on getting their money. I mean, I almost cried when the bipartisan infrastructure law was announced. I was like, 1.3 trillion. Oh my God! It's and I was
and bipartisan too.
I know.
Yeah.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
It's like, talk about a political achievement.
Yeah.
And then we saw the money, and then we waited and waited, and it's like.
We have to, especially you and I, we have to broaden our view. As you said, a lot of money's come to New York, and Governor Hochul has exercised tremendous leadership and done a phenomenal job capturing a lot of that money. I think the governor's gotten more of it than any of her peers in the other states.
Yeah.
But the feds, as they said they would, and as the law was written, they prioritized expansion, running more trains, getting more people on trains, and that was the right decision. So Penn Access is the right decision. The station becomes, I think this is a perfect case study for another problem with Penn, a phrase that I like to point to. It's an orphan project, right? That's what it is, an orphan project.
I don't know, nobody takes ownership.
Penn's definitely unique, but Union Station is in dire need of modernization too, believe it or not, and especially in its tracks, in its rail infrastructure.
Yeah. But
it too is orphaned.
Well, but Penn as well. And, we talk a lot, and you and I have had these conversations where, I have been very careful not to latch on to the physical improvements of Penn.
Yeah, right.
And because I've been looking at the way Europe builds rail infrastructure, and they start with the scheduler. Basically, the guy who has the most important job with Deutsche Bahn is the scheduler. And I think the word in German is Zeitführer. It's like the master of the time.
I know some German, yeah.
and this basically, he is the guy who says, in 30 years, this is where we need trains to go.
Yeah.
When, at what time, and at what frequency.
That's a very German way of doing things.
But it's not only the Germans. The French do it the same way, and the Brits.
Yeah.
It's like, this is where we need the trains to go.
Right.
And then we build the infrastructure around it, and then we make it pretty.
Well,
and here we are talking about, fixing Penn Station, when in reality the question is, where do you want these trains to go from, to go to, how fast, and at what frequency.
Yeah.
And this is why, I see through running the modality of moving trains through Penn Station as being the most critical question. Yeah. And then, the infrastructure and, the capital build out, where do you put the tracks? Do you need to add tracks where they already exist? Do you need to, what sort of capital work you need to do? And then make it pretty.
Yeah.
The sort of like make it pretty will come last. And we know it will be pretty.
Yeah.
But if it's not effective, it's not going to work. And also the part that I feel we should all focus on is the economic growth that will come out of expanding the connectivity and the capacity.
Yeah.
Like the induced growth that nobody looks at.
I think you're 100% right. And my favorite part of everything you've said is I think it just stitches together this whole masterclass that we've been having here. Why that is the right prescription. Why isn't it happening? Because we have jurisdictional issues. Why can't we have the Zeitführer? Because we don't have a Deutsche Bahn for the whole of Germany, and we don't have an SNCF, and we don't have what is the Japan JR Central, and we don't have Trenitalia, and the list goes on and on, right? We have instead 3 railroads who stop at a river and stare at each other. That's what we have. And it's not their fault. It's the way that the laws have been not even written. They've been accidentally accumulated over time, and no one in Congress has really bothered to do anything about it. That's kind of what's happened.
We do
They're
have
artifacts.
But we do have a Northeast Corridor Commission.
Which
you sit on it.
I sat on it. Yes, I was the co-chairman, as a matter of fact. NECC should have public meetings.
Yeah.
So no harm to have people sitting in the back and listening and seeing what's going on. But what's their job? I mean. They've done a lot of great work. The staff is super talented, but they just don't have, in the end of the day, I guess you could say they're all carrot, no stick.
And in an equal way, so that
in an equal way based on their usage.
Yeah.
And that applies to capital and state of good repair, and it's annualized. So now again. At the beginning of this conversation, we talked about that huge hole that we're in and how deep it is after 40 or 50 years of disinvestment. So they baselined it at 0. In other words, they didn't say, okay, there's, in 2008, probably a $25 billion state of good repair backlog. Everyone's going to share that accordingly. They just pretended that the system was brand new, that the Northeast Corridor opened in 2008. And from this point on, we all share capital and operating expenses according to our use. So that money doesn't go very far.
But is it per mile, or is it per passenger, or it's like, there's something a little off in their metrics.
Is it per mile or per railroad mile? That's the one role that they have is everyone gets together, and every few years the policy is updated. In fact, they haven't changed it since I was on the commission, and I played a big role in its last update. That was part of how we got Portal Bridge funded. We actually had to update the policy to accommodate a mega project because the policy was not originally conceived of for mega projects.
So do they have a role to play with Penn?
They surely will at some point, but they play always a supporting role. I would imagine that over the last 4 years, 3.5 years, I'm sure they've had some discussions about Penn in their quarterly board meetings, but there's no public.
It's that time of the show where we get fast and curious. We are about to embark on a quick quiz, and I'm excited to have our guest, Peter Cipriano, here with us. Peter, you ready to play with me?
I think so.
Fantastic. So get ready for a quick round of questions. So Peter, I will start the sentence and you will finish it.
Okay.
You ready? Penn Station is a dump, but
we have every opportunity and possibility to change that fact.
The future of this country is mass transit, but
don't forget rural America. I think mass transit, yes, has to grow in its modal share, but micro-mobility has to grow as well. And we don't really have that. We're not great at it. There's a lot of talk about it. Rural America can't be left behind. And micro-mobility will be their version of mass transit, and we have to make sure that they get that too.
Building anything in the U.S. is 3 times more expensive than anywhere else, but
Building anything in the U.S. is 3 times more expensive
than anywhere else in the
Really?
world. Yes.
Like a house? Building a house?
No, infrastructure.
Oh, infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But our GDP is also like what is it now? 6 or 7 times the size of everyone but China. So Japan, Germany, France, UK. So we have our economic growth is leaps and bounds beyond our peer countries, and so costs necessarily go up also. People shouldn't be too fazed by that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way of looking at it. Rail should be a bipartisan issue, but
it increasingly is. I think 30 years ago, definitely not. 20 years ago, the Republicans very much on board with freight rail. Quickly, I'll give you a sense. In D.C., when people think about rail, we don't talk about it as much in New York, but for most of the country, freight rail's everything.
Yeah.
People work for the railroad or their jobs related to the railroad. So members of Congress and U.S. senators are very concerned about how CSX feels. How does Norfolk Southern feel?
And actually, freight is profitable, mostly.
Oh, massively. And
Wow.
it's worth noting that while we have languished behind the rest of the world with high-speed rail, passenger rail, mass transit, and we spent this whole hour talking about that, we actually beat the rest of the world. Beat it outright when it comes to moving freight by rail.
There are already 9 high-speed train lines in Japan and none in the U.S., but
there will soon be one. Actually, one thing we didn't talk about, the Las Vegas to Los Angeles high-speed train, which I do believe will get built, and Secretary Buttigieg and President Biden deserve a tremendous amount of credit for trusting a private enterprise with a giant grant. There'll be a lot of accountability that goes with that grant and a lot of oversight. I think it was a historically brave decision, because giving a couple $billion to a private equity outfit, I mean, I couldn't get the keys to Penn Station.
the bipartisan infrastructure law represents $1.3 trillion, and none so far for Penn Station, but
hope springs eternal. You know, we've waited so long to fix Penn. We'll have to wait a little longer. The MTA did do a great job making the concourse ceiling higher and bringing in some light, not daylight, but you know, making it better illuminated, I think is the word. They may want to continue some of that improvement. I think that stuff's interim, but it's good.
Public-private partnerships have a complicated history, but
that's not a reason to run away from them. I think the important thing is everybody has to go in eyes wide open. Everyone has to go in honest and with good intention. Contracts have to be written really, really well. They have to be checked and double-checked and triple-checked. You've got to pick your partners wisely, just like in a marriage. And if you do all of those things, then you get a LaGuardia Terminal B. You get a tremendous success. So, you know, for every P3 failure, I can point to 3 successes.
Mark Twain said there are 3 types of lies. There are lies, there are damn lies, and there's statistics. But
check your facts. Whenever you're getting fed information, I guess you have to diligence whether it's a lie, a damn lie, or a statistic.
is there a way to sort of like, you know, fudge the numbers? Are we being given the numbers that fit a particular narrative? And
are you talking about Penn Station, or what are you talking about?
Generally speaking, you know, the trends on, you know, people don't want to go to 8th Avenue, people don't want through running, or, you know, it's
all you need to do is look back to Enron to be reminded that numbers can be fudged. Even the SEC, even institutional investors can be sometimes fooled. Data's everything. Do the work, right? Do the work. Like anything else, infrastructure turns out best when people do the work on a collaborative basis before they start building something. And that's what we did with Penn. You know, that's why we spent that 3 years with our tremendous partners at Madison Square Garden doing the work, scanning the building and taking measurements and opening up walls and looking at steel columns and saying, is this brittle? Will this last another 50 years? Does this need to be removed? You name it. Data matters big time.
Yeah, great.
AI will help.
Oh my God. So what, AI is the future of Penn Station?
Well, I don't know, but about Penn State, you know,
or the savior.
AI is going to play a transformative role in construction globally, but probably in the United States first. And depending on when Penn Station gets built, it may be part of the story.
Yeah.
But absolutely, I mean.
But AI is also going to play a tremendous role in the way people work. And
yes.
As a result, it will have major repercussions on transportation.
It will. And we've been, you know, don't forget, Layla, 120 years ago, if we stepped outside this studio, which was probably some kind of a, I think this is a pre-war building. This was probably a rows of seamstresses here. There would have been horses. And nobody could have imagined a New York City without horses. So we go through generational transformational change in transportation, and we can't resist it because it's important. You know, that kind of transportation innovation is really important.
Yeah.
So if you think about the speed at which a person moves and the speed at which information moves, for basically all of human history, the speed of a person and the speed of information were the same, right? So on your x-axis, the 2 lines are one line.
Okay.
And then, you know, you get to Rome when they figure out how to pave a road and create the first highway, stone-paved highway, and you have just, you know, slight increases, efficiencies found in moving information, because you also have paper is invented, papyrus, whatever, systems of writing, more and more people can write, paper economies of scale becomes more accessible. Then there are people who are just taking messages back and forth, more roads, more systems. So slowly, information is traveling faster than people. Then you get the telegraph, and then you get the telephone, and then you get the radio. And then you fast forward to, let's say, you know, the last 25 years, when you can not just transmit information at light speed, but you can now transmit ever increasing amounts of information. So from my phone, I can send an entire PDF to your phone wherever you are in the world with a ton of data.
Yeah.
So the two lines that for thousands of years were the same have now gone like that.
Yeah.
But people move basically at the same speed. There's been increase with, you know, the railroad, the airplane, the car, so it's gone up, but the slope of people's speed is like this, and information is now in an infinity symbol. It's just in the sky.
Yeah.
So the delta between those two lines is actually a problem, and it's an innovation center. Innovation and capital, in my opinion, wants to go into that delta because it's a gap that has to be addressed. I don't know if we'll ever have warp speed like Star Trek. I don't think people can or maybe need to travel at infinity speed, but a gap that yawning is a problem that has to be solved. So we can't be afraid of innovation in transportation.
Although I have to say that the appeal of moving at light speed is...
And I would say, you know, this is how Staten Islanders have felt for decades, and how they still feel. And they do have an accommodation with the Verrazano. They have a resident discount, but even so, when you're on an island and your only way on or off is a tolled crossing,
Yeah.
you know, this is why they're always angry on Staten
Yeah.
Island.
So are you going to build a train service
Oh,
to Staten Island?
maybe that's a good idea. We could do it together. I'll start digging now.
Well, isn't that what the mayor of San Francisco said? You know, dig a big hole.
Yeah, yes.
And then they'll have to pay to fix it.
Yes, yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Peter,
Thank
for
you.
Joining me on this show. Thank you for this great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today on Carte Blanche. It's been an enlightening and engaging conversation with our guest, Peter Cipriano. I hope you now find infrastructure sexy. And before we sign off, I want to remind everyone that your engagement and active participation are essential. Stay informed, ask questions, and let your voices be heard. Together, we can shape the future of our city and our region. So until next time, keep the dialogue going, and remember that here at Carte Blanche, the stage is always set for unscripted conversations. This was Carte Blanche. Have a fantastic evening, everyone.